What you're about to hear is a tale so terrifying, so steeped in spiritual power and supernatural vengeance, that it has haunted the cemeteries and voodoo temples of New Orleans for over a century. This is not merely a story of pilgrims who lost their way in a graveyard or fell victim to grave robbers. This is the documented account of 15 devoted practitioners of voodoo who journeyed to the tomb of the most powerful priestess in Louisiana history seeking her blessing, and the complete disappearance that would shake the spiritual community of New Orleans to its very core. This is the true story of the Marie Laveau pilgrimage of 1889, where faith became a doorway to realms beyond human understanding, and where the price of seeking divine power was nothing less than existence itself. The year was 1889, and New Orleans was a city where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds had always been thin. The unique cultural heritage of the Crescent City had created a spiritual landscape unlike anywhere else in America, where African traditions, Catholic mysticism, Native American shamanism, and Caribbean folk magic had blended into something entirely new and profoundly powerful. At the heart of this spiritual ecosystem was the practice of voodoo, a religion that had evolved from the forced marriage of African spiritual traditions with the Catholicism imposed by European colonizers. Marie Laveau, the legendary voodoo queen of New Orleans, had died in 1881, but her influence on the spiritual life of the city had only grown stronger in death. During her lifetime, she had been the most powerful and feared spiritual practitioner in Louisiana, a woman whose abilities seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of human understanding. She had served as healer, advisor, and spiritual guide to people from every level of New Orleans society, from the poorest slaves to the wealthiest plantation owners, all of whom recognized her extraordinary gifts. Her tomb in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 had become a pilgrimage site almost immediately after her burial, drawing visitors from across the South and beyond who sought her continued intercession in their spiritual and worldly affairs. The elaborate above-ground tomb, necessary in a city where the water table made underground burial impossible, had become covered with offerings, prayers, and the mysterious X marks that pilgrims would draw on its walls before making their requests. The 15 practitioners who would undertake the fateful pilgrimage of 1889 represented some of the most devoted and spiritually advanced members of New Orleans' voodoo community. They came from different backgrounds and traditions within the religion, but they were united by their deep reverence for Marie Laveau and their belief that her spirit continued to guide and protect those who honored her memory with proper devotion. Leading the group was Mama Bridget Thibodeau, an elderly Creole woman who claimed direct spiritual lineage from Marie Laveau herself. Mama Bridget had been one of the voodoo queen's most trusted disciples during her lifetime, and she possessed knowledge of rituals and practices that had been passed down through generations of spiritual practitioners. Her reputation for supernatural abilities was legendary throughout the city, and her decision to organize a formal pilgrimage to Marie Laveau's tomb was seen as an event of profound spiritual significance. Among her followers was Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, a young man whose family had practiced voodoo for generations but who had only recently begun to demonstrate the extraordinary spiritual gifts that marked him as a potential successor to the great practitioners of the past. Jean-Baptiste's ability to communicate with spirits and his deep understanding of the complex rituals that governed voodoo practice had already earned him recognition as one of the most promising spiritual leaders of his generation. The group also included Celeste Boudreau, a middle-aged woman whose healing abilities had made her one of the most sought-after practitioners in the French Quarter. Celeste's knowledge of herbal medicine and her ability to diagnose spiritual ailments had saved countless lives over the years, and her participation in the pilgrimage was seen as a guarantee of the group's spiritual protection during their sacred journey. From the Tremé district came Toussaint Beauregard, an elderly man whose mastery of drumming and ritual music had made him an essential participant in the most important voodoo ceremonies throughout the city. Toussaint's rhythms were said to open doorways between the physical and spiritual worlds, and his presence at any ritual was considered crucial for ensuring proper communication with the spirits. The remaining 11 pilgrims represented the diversity of New Orleans' voodoo community, descendants of slaves who had preserved African spiritual traditions through centuries of oppression, Creoles who had blended European and African practices into something uniquely Louisiana, immigrants from Haiti and other Caribbean islands who had brought their own variations of the religion, and even a few white practitioners who had been accepted into the community through their demonstrated devotion and spiritual gifts. The pilgrimage was planned for the night of November 1, 1889, All Saints' Day, when the barriers between the world of the living and the realm of the dead were traditionally at their thinnest. This timing was deliberate, as Mama Bridget believed that Marie Laveau's spirit would be most accessible on this sacred night, and that the group's prayers and offerings would be received with particular favor. The ritual preparations for the pilgrimage began weeks in advance, with each participant undergoing spiritual purification and gathering the specific offerings that would be presented at Marie Laveau's tomb. These offerings included items that had been sacred to the Voodoo Queen during her lifetime: perfumes, jewelry, flowers, candles, and specially prepared foods that honored both her African heritage and her Catholic faith. The most important offering was a collection of written petitions from members of the Voodoo community throughout New Orleans who were unable to participate in the pilgrimage personally. These petitions, written on special paper that had been blessed in various ceremonies, contained requests for healing, protection, justice, and spiritual guidance. The pilgrims saw themselves as spiritual messengers carrying the hopes and prayers of their entire community to the most powerful advocate they could imagine. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, where Marie Laveau's tomb was located, was one of the most spiritually charged locations in New Orleans. The cemetery, established in the 1780s, contained the remains of some of the most influential and powerful individuals in the city's history, including other Voodoo practitioners, Catholic saints, and political leaders whose spirits were believed to continue influencing the affairs of the living. The cemetery's above-ground tombs, necessitated by New Orleans' high water table and frequent flooding, created a unique landscape that resembled a city of the dead. The elaborate mausoleums and family tombs were arranged along narrow pathways that wound through the cemetery like streets, creating an environment where visitors could easily become lost among the monuments to mortality. Marie Laveau's tomb was located in a particularly significant section of the cemetery, surrounded by the graves of other powerful spiritual practitioners and positioned in a way that seemed to channel and focus the spiritual energy that flowed through the entire burial ground. The tomb itself was a modest structure compared to some of the more elaborate monuments in the cemetery, but its spiritual significance far exceeded its physical grandeur. On the evening of November 1, 1889, the 15 pilgrims gathered at Mama Bridget's house in the Treme district to begin their sacred journey. They were dressed in white clothing that had been specially blessed for the occasion, and each carried a white candle that would be lit when they reached Marie Laveau's tomb. The atmosphere was solemn and reverent, as all participants understood that they were undertaking a spiritual journey that could have profound consequences for their lives and their relationship with the supernatural world. The procession to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 followed a route that had been carefully planned to maximize the spiritual significance of the journey. The pilgrims walked through neighborhoods where Marie Laveau had lived and worked, pausing at locations that had been important in her life and career as a spiritual leader. At each stop, they performed brief rituals and offered prayers that honored her memory and requested her continued guidance. As they approached the cemetery, the pilgrims began to notice unusual atmospheric phenomena that suggested they were entering a space where normal physical laws might not apply. The air became thick and heavy, carrying scents of flowers and incense that seemed to have no earthly source. The temperature fluctuated wildly, sometimes becoming almost unbearably hot, then dropping to a bone-chilling cold that made their breath visible in the humid New Orleans air. The cemetery gates, which should have been locked at that hour, stood open as if they had been expecting the pilgrims' arrival. The caretaker who normally secured the grounds was nowhere to be seen, and the usual sounds of the city seemed muffled and distant, as if the cemetery existed in a pocket of reality that was separate from the normal world. As the 15 pilgrims entered St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, they found themselves in an environment that was both familiar and profoundly altered. The tombs and monuments that they had visited countless times before seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with their white candles. The narrow pathways between the graves appeared to extend further than should have been possible given the cemetery's known dimensions, and the arrangement of the tombs seemed to have changed in subtle ways that created new patterns of spiritual energy. Mama Bridget led the group through the cemetery using knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Voodoo practitioners. She knew which paths would lead them safely to Marie Laveau's tomb and which routes might expose them to spiritual dangers that could overwhelm even experienced practitioners. Her guidance was essential, as the cemetery on All Saints' Night was filled with supernatural forces that could easily mislead or trap unwary visitors. The journey to Marie Laveau's tomb normally took only a few minutes, but on this night it seemed to stretch on for hours. The pilgrims found themselves walking through sections of the cemetery that none of them remembered seeing before, past tombs bearing names they didn't recognize and monuments that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The spiritual energy in the air grew stronger with each step, until it became almost overwhelming in its intensity. When they finally reached Marie Laveau's tomb, the pilgrims found it transformed from the modest monument they had visited so many times before. The tomb seemed to have grown larger and more elaborate, its surfaces covered with symbols and decorations that appeared to be carved from light itself rather than stone. The X marks that visitors traditionally drew on the tomb's walls were glowing with an inner fire, and the offerings that had been left by previous pilgrims seemed to have been transformed into something more precious and beautiful than their original forms. The 15 pilgrims arranged themselves in a circle around the tomb and began the ritual that Mama Bridget had designed specifically for this pilgrimage. They lit their white candles in unison, creating a ring of light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a vast, unseen heartbeat. The petitions they had brought were placed on the tomb with prayers and offerings, and each pilgrim spoke their personal requests for Marie Laveau's intercession in their lives and the lives of their community. As the ritual progressed, the spiritual energy around the tomb began to build to levels that exceeded anything the pilgrims had experienced in their previous practices. The air itself seemed to become charged with power, and the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds began to dissolve. The pilgrims found themselves able to see and hear things that existed beyond normal human perception, including the spirits of other voodoo practitioners who had come to witness their ceremony. It was at the climax of the ritual that Marie Laveau herself appeared to the pilgrims, not as a ghost or vision, but as a living presence that seemed more real and substantial than the physical world around them. The legendary voodoo queen appeared as she had in life, but transformed and elevated by her years in the spiritual realm. Her presence was both beautiful and terrible, radiating a power that made it clear why she had been revered and feared throughout New Orleans during her lifetime. Marie Laveau spoke to the pilgrims in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, addressing each of them by name and acknowledging their devotion and spiritual development. She praised their faith and their commitment to preserving the traditions that she had spent her life establishing and protecting, but she also warned them that their pilgrimage had brought them to the attention of spiritual forces that existed far beyond the normal scope of voodoo practice. The voodoo queen explained that their ritual had opened a doorway between the world of the living and realms that existed beyond death, beyond time, and beyond human understanding. She had appeared not to grant their requests, but to offer them a choice that would determine their fate for eternity. They could return to their normal lives, carrying with them enhanced spiritual abilities and her continued protection, or they could cross the threshold into the spiritual realm and join her in a form of existence that transcended all human limitations. The choice was not one that could be made lightly or quickly. Marie Laveau gave the pilgrims time to consider their options, explaining that those who chose to remain in the physical world would find their spiritual abilities greatly enhanced but would also carry the burden of serving as bridges between the living and the dead. Those who chose to cross into the spiritual realm would gain access to knowledge and power beyond human imagination, but would no longer be able to interact with the physical world in any meaningful way. One by one, the 15 pilgrims made their decisions. Some were drawn by the promise of enhanced spiritual abilities that would allow them to better serve their community and continue Marie Laveau's work in the physical world. Others were attracted by the opportunity to transcend human limitations and exist in a realm where spiritual power was unlimited and eternal. As each pilgrim made their choice, they began to fade from the physical world, not through death but through a transformation that elevated them to a different plane of existence. Those who chose to remain in the physical world found themselves back in the normal cemetery, standing around Marie Laveau's ordinary tomb with their candles burned down to stubs and their offerings consumed by some supernatural fire. But those who chose to cross into the spiritual realm simply vanished, leaving no trace of their physical existence except for the memories of their fellow pilgrims. They had not died in any conventional sense, but had been translated into a form of existence that existed beyond the boundaries of life and death, beyond the limitations of time and space. When dawn broke over St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 on November 2, 1889, none of the 15 pilgrims who had entered the cemetery the night before emerged to greet the morning. The cemetery caretaker, who had no memory of leaving the gates unlocked, found no evidence that anyone had been in the cemetery during the night. The only sign of the pilgrimage was a circle of melted candle wax around Marie Laveau's tomb and the lingering scent of flowers and incense that seemed to have no earthly source. The disappearance of the 15 pilgrims sent shockwaves through New Orleans' voodoo community. These were not unknown practitioners or casual followers, but some of the most respected and powerful spiritual leaders in the city. Their complete disappearance without any physical evidence of their fate challenged the community's understanding of the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds. Mama Bridget's house in the Treme district was found exactly as she had left it, with ritual preparations still in place and personal belongings undisturbed. There was no evidence of struggle, no sign that she had planned to leave permanently, and no indication of what had happened to her during the pilgrimage. Her extensive library of spiritual texts and ritual implements remained untouched, as if she had simply stepped out for a brief errand and would return at any moment. Jean-Baptiste Rousseau's family waited for months for some word of his fate, but no explanation was ever found for his disappearance. His spiritual gifts had been so promising that his loss was felt throughout the Voodoo community as a tragedy that would affect the religion's future development. The rituals and practices that he had been learning were lost with him, creating gaps in the community's spiritual knowledge that would never be fully filled. Celeste Boudreau's patients, who had depended on her healing abilities for their physical and spiritual well-being, were left without their most trusted spiritual advisor. Her knowledge of herbal medicine and her ability to diagnose spiritual ailments had been irreplaceable, and her disappearance created a crisis in the community's ability to provide spiritual healing to those who needed it most. The investigation into the Pilgrims' disappearance was complicated by the reluctance of the Voodoo community to discuss their spiritual practices with outside authorities. The New Orleans police force of 1889 had little understanding of or sympathy for Voodoo religion, and their investigation focused on conventional explanations such as foul play or mass suicide rather than supernatural causes. The Catholic Church, which had always maintained an uneasy relationship with Voodoo practice in New Orleans, saw the disappearance as evidence of the dangers inherent in non-Christian spiritual practices. Some priests used the incident as an opportunity to warn their parishioners against involvement with Voodoo, while others quietly acknowledged that the Pilgrims' fate suggested the existence of spiritual forces that transcended conventional religious understanding. Within the Voodoo community itself, the disappearance was interpreted in various ways. Some practitioners believed that the Pilgrims had been chosen by Marie Laveau for a special spiritual mission that required them to leave the physical world behind. Others worried that they had fallen victim to malevolent spiritual forces that had been attracted by their powerful ritual. The most widely accepted explanation within the community was that the Pilgrims had achieved a form of spiritual transcendence that allowed them to join Marie Laveau in the realm of the ancestors. This interpretation was supported by reports from other practitioners who claimed to have received spiritual communications from the missing Pilgrims, suggesting that they continued to exist in some form beyond physical death. In the months following the disappearance, several other Voodoo practitioners reported encountering the missing Pilgrims in dreams and visions. These spiritual communications suggested that the 15 had indeed crossed into a higher realm of existence where they continued to serve as spiritual guides and protectors for the Voodoo community. The messages they conveyed through these supernatural encounters provided guidance and comfort to those who had been left behind. The impact of the Pilgrims' disappearance on Voodoo practice in New Orleans was profound and lasting. Many practitioners became more cautious about undertaking powerful rituals, particularly those that involved direct communication with deceased spiritual leaders. The incident served as a reminder that Voodoo was not merely a collection of folk practices but a genuine spiritual system capable of producing effects that transcended normal human understanding. The ritual techniques that Mama Bridget had developed for the pilgrimage were never attempted again, as the community decided that the risks were too great for the potential benefits. The knowledge of how to perform such powerful spiritual workings was deliberately allowed to die with the missing practitioners, ensuring that future generations would not accidentally stumble into similar supernatural territory. Marie Laveau's tomb became even more popular as a pilgrimage site after the disappearance, but visitors approached it with greater reverence and caution. The incident had demonstrated that the Voodoo Queen spirit was not merely a benevolent ancestor who could be petitioned for favors, but a powerful spiritual entity whose intercession could have consequences that extended far beyond the petitioner's original intentions. The cemetery authorities at St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 began to notice unusual phenomena around Marie Laveau's tomb in the years following the pilgrimage. Visitors reported seeing figures in white clothing standing around the tomb at night, and some claimed to hear the sound of ritual drumming and chanting coming from the area where the 15 pilgrims had performed their ceremony. The spiritual energy around the tomb seemed to have been permanently altered by the pilgrimage, with many visitors reporting enhanced spiritual experiences and more powerful responses to their prayers and offerings. Some practitioners believed that the missing pilgrims had become permanent guardians of the site, using their transcended state to facilitate communication between the living and the dead. Modern paranormal investigators have attempted to study the site of the 1889 pilgrimage using contemporary scientific equipment, but their efforts have yielded inconclusive results. The spiritual phenomena associated with Marie Laveau's tomb seem to exist outside the range of conventional scientific measurement, suggesting that they operate according to principles that transcend normal physical laws. The psychological impact of the disappearance on the surviving members of the Voodoo community was significant and long-lasting. Many practitioners struggled with questions about the nature of spiritual transcendence and the risks associated with seeking direct contact with powerful spiritual entities. The incident forced the community to develop new guidelines for spiritual practice that emphasized safety and caution while preserving the essential elements of their religious tradition. The story of the 15 Pilgrims became part of the oral tradition of New Orleans voodoo, passed down through generations as both a testament to the power of genuine spiritual practice and a warning about the potential consequences of seeking transcendence without proper preparation and understanding. The tale served to preserve important spiritual knowledge while ensuring that future practitioners would approach powerful rituals with appropriate respect and caution. The incident also influenced the development of voodoo practice beyond New Orleans, as news of the disappearance spread through spiritual communities throughout the South and the Caribbean. Practitioners in other regions began to develop their own safety protocols for powerful rituals, and the story of the pilgrimage became a cautionary tale that was told wherever voodoo was practiced. The academic study of voodoo religion has been influenced by the 1889 pilgrimage incident. Though most scholars approach it as folklore rather than historical fact, the story provides insights into the beliefs and practices of 19th-century voodoo practitioners, regardless of whether the supernatural elements are accepted as literal truth. The case has also attracted the attention of researchers studying religious experience and altered states of consciousness. The detailed accounts of the pilgrims' spiritual experiences, preserved in the oral tradition of the voodoo community, provide valuable data for understanding how religious practitioners interpret and integrate profound spiritual encounters. The influence of the pilgrimage story on popular culture has been significant, with elements of the tale appearing in numerous books, films, and other works of fiction about voodoo and New Orleans spirituality. These fictional treatments often sensationalize the supernatural elements while minimizing the genuine spiritual significance of the incident for the voodoo community. The site of Marie Laveau's tomb continues to attract visitors from around the world, many of whom are drawn by the story of the 15 Pilgrims and the promise of powerful spiritual experiences. The tomb remains one of the most visited sites in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, though modern visitors are required to take guided tours that limit their access to the monument itself. The Voodoo community of New Orleans continues to honor the memory of the 15 Pilgrims through annual ceremonies that commemorate their sacrifice and celebrate their spiritual achievement. These modern rituals are carefully designed to avoid the powerful techniques that led to the original disappearance, focusing instead on honoring the Pilgrims' memory and seeking their continued spiritual guidance. As we reach the end of this profound journey into the spiritual heart of New Orleans voodoo, we are left with questions that challenge our understanding of the relationship between faith, power, and transcendence. What really happened to those 15 devoted practitioners who sought Marie Laveau's blessing on that All Saints' Night in 1889? Did they achieve a form of spiritual transcendence that allowed them to join their beloved voodoo queen in a realm beyond human understanding? Or did they fall victim to forces that exist at the dangerous intersection of devotion and cosmic mystery? The empty spaces they left behind in their community remain as testament to both the power of genuine spiritual practice and the risks that await those who seek to transcend the boundaries of human existence. In the shadowy cemeteries and hidden temples of New Orleans, where the barriers between life and death have always been thin, some prayers are answered in ways that the petitioners never imagined, and some blessings come with prices that extend far beyond the physical world. The candles that burned around Marie Laveau's tomb that night may have been extinguished by dawn, but their light continues to shine in the hearts of those who understand that true spiritual power requires not just faith and devotion, but the courage to accept whatever consequences that power might bring. For in the end, when we seek the intercession of forces beyond human understanding, we may find that we receive exactly what we asked for, even if it means leaving behind everything we thought we knew about existence itself. If this profound tale of spiritual transcendence and the ultimate price of devotion has left you questioning the true nature of faith and the boundaries between life and death, please show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement helps us continue to explore these sacred mysteries that remind us why some prayers should be offered only by those prepared to accept any answer they might receive. And if you haven't already joined our community of truth seekers here at Bayou Nightmares, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We delve deep into the spiritual shadows of history every week, bringing you stories that mainstream sources often dismiss or misunderstand. From the sacred cemeteries of New Orleans to the hidden temples where ancient powers still hold sway, we explore the mysteries that shaped our spiritual world. It's important to remember that while the stories we share on Bayou Nightmares are carefully researched and based on historical accounts, they are presented as entertainment and educational content. Some elements may be dramatized or interpreted through the lens of folklore and legend, though they are often inspired by real events and genuine spiritual experiences that deserve to be remembered and understood. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, keep questioning the boundaries between the possible and impossible, keep seeking the truth behind the legends, and remember that sometimes the most profound spiritual experiences are those that take us beyond the safety of the known world into realms where faith becomes the only guide. This has been Bayou Nightmares, where the past never truly dies, and the darkest secrets eventually find their way to the light.